Right. Can everybody hear me okay? Dave, can you hear me right?
Yes, Vaughan. Yeah, you can continue.
Okay. Excellent. All right. So good evening, everybody. Tonight we're going to be talking about debt, and in particular, as I've called it here, declaring war on debt. And I think the goal tonight is really two things. Firstly, we want to kind of get our hands a little bit dirty, get practical on debt. I think even if we're not very inclined for numbers, I think there should be a certain amount of understanding we have in terms of debt, because it can get quite detailed. But I'm hoping we can at least just get a certain basic understanding, because very often debt is a fairly big chunk of our expenses. So it's quite important to have a sense of or a handle on it to some extent at least. So we're going to try to get a bit practical, but also I'm hoping to just convey the heart in line with kind of what Dave was praying. I think that we need to have, I don't want to use the word hatred because it's quite such a strong word but I mean, we need to have a passionate dislike for debt. And our goal has to be to chip away at the block. So I'm hoping, that comes through. So we're going to briefly go through just a couple of scriptures just to get our minds ticking. Then we're going to talk a bit about the difference between responsible and irresponsible debt. And then we'll start getting a little bit more practical, looking at why it's worthwhile prioritizing debt over savings. We'll then get into some understanding of how much does debt actually cost, and we're going to use examples to do that. At the end, if we have time, I'll see how it goes. But very often I'm asked a question around renting versus buying. Now, this may be in the context of, accommodation, but the same principles apply whether you're renting versus buying certain kinds of equipment. It's a similar principle that comes through there. So that's our journey today. Just a reminder, in case anybody's joining us for the first time, hopefully by now you see this picture in your sleep, and I'm repeating it on purpose. Because I think, remember, the goal is it's not just for us, this is for us to help other people as well. So, we all need to be able to explain this. Remember, week 1, we basically said, remember that money's influence, or mammon, if you want to use it like that, is a battle to own you. So you either got to own money or it's going to own you. So that was the bad news, but the good news is that's not God's plan. God's plan is financial freedom and to leave a legacy. And that the 4 steps that we've been going through are the 4 steps towards that. Remember, step 1 was we have to have on a regular basis money left over at the end of each month, i.e. there's some margin. Then what we're going to talk about this week is how do we now use that margin to kill our debt? Because now that we've got margin, it gives us an opportunity to work on debt. Once we've killed our debt, we can start moving to step 3, which is then we use the money that we used to use for paying debt, we now use to invest. And as we start investing that money, we don't only earn a salary, but we now get income from a source outside of us. And so that starts giving us, the green line grows. And until we get to the point where that green line has grown to such an extent that actually, even if you took our salary away, we could still pay our obligation, needs, and wants. And that's actually when we are financially free. Not that means we stop working, but it just means we are free. So that's just a quick recap. Hope that picture sticks in our heads. So this week we're going to focus in on debt. So I think the first thing I just want to go into a little bit more detail. I have said this before. So let's imagine that we have 1,000 Rand store debt. And what I want to suggest is don't try and necessarily start with your biggest long-term debt. Start with the smaller debt, and I'll explain to you why this often works better. I mean, obviously, if you've got enough money to be tackling bigger debt, that's great, go for it. But very often people, the margin there is such that, you've got to start with your smaller expensive debt. So that will normally be debt such as, for the typical salaried person, that's going to be debt such as your store credit, any short-term loans that you've taken. So what we're saying is, let's say that I had 1,000 rand, I was paying off a credit card or a store credit every month. What we're saying then is, in that 1,000 rand, remember that let's say 900 rand is paying off the debt I owe, and 100 rand is usually the interest they're charging me. For argument's sake, I'm just making a simple example. So let's say we use that margin now of whatever, we've got a 500 bucks a month freed up. We then use that 500 rand to pay off towards that 1,000 rand debt. So we didn't pay 1,000 rand this month, we now pay 1,500 rand off. What that will mean is next month, our repayment for that same debt won't need to be 1,000 rand anymore, because obviously we've paid a little bit extra. It might be 980 bucks, for argument's sake. And so now, strictly speaking, we've got a little bit more margin to pay off debt as well. And so you repeat that cycle of paying a little bit more. The next month, that debt is a little bit less, but you still keep paying off the original amount plus. And as you free up debt, you start adding that, that debt that used to then be 1,000 rand. You now don't only have your margin, but you've got the 1,000 rand debt you used to pay off that has now also been freed up. So what starts happening is those little small debts start compounding, where you then eventually can start paying off your bigger debts. So I hope that cycle makes sense, what I've described. But that's really the process of how you systematically, pay off this debt. And it's not a quick thing, this. I mean, usually, depending upon the nature of your debt and whether it's 20-year loans and things you're talking about, I mean, this could be a 5-year, 7-year journey that you embark on. What's important is make a start. And once you start, don't get tired, basically, don't give up. And also don't, as that debt block starts coming down, don't give in to the temptation where you increase your standard of living. That's the concept of a closed circle, to say, no, we keep our budget like it was, even if my debts have now come down. You rather want that margin block to grow, because that then allows you to pay off even quicker against other debt. So I hope that makes sense. We've gone through that cycle, if I can call it the positive debt payment cycle, before. So I hope that makes sense. So remember, that's now what we're talking about. So just quickly to go through a couple of the scriptures that you may have bumped into. So I think the first thing is just to say, the Bible has a fairly strong warning against debt. It definitely encourages us not to go into debt, but it doesn't say we can't have debt. And so one example is Romans 13:8. It basically says, let no debt remain outstanding except the debt of love. It also makes clear that when we are indebted, it's like we're a slave, where it says the rich rule over the poor and the borrower becomes the lender's slave. And that's really true, because once we owe money, we have limits placed upon us in terms of some of our choices and some of our freedom. It also, if you are in the position where you are on the other side of the equation of debt, it has a strong warning about taking advantage of, where lenders take advantage. So, there are not many of us who are in that situation, but probably to the banks and some of these loan sharks, quite a serious warning. And obviously, it's very critical if we don't pay back our debt. And like I said, there, it basically says stealing. And then an important principle, and this Dave was alluding to this when he prayed, is, there was this real sense in the Bible that people shouldn't be enslaved. And so there was this process of certain debts being cleared every 7 years. And then every 7 times 7 years, there was an even bigger sense of freedom and release of debts that took place. Go and read up about it. It will really just inspire you to say, should we be going into such long-term debt, and do we have choices about it? And yes, today it is tricky, but I think there are ways of dealing with it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about responsible and irresponsible debt. So although I've kind of said, there should be this passionate dislike for debt, I think I'm just trying to balance that by saying, not all debt is basically bad. So if I asked you the question, how would you define responsible debt and how would you define irresponsible debt? And so what I want to suggest is that if you are going into debt to buy anything that will yield a return, that is responsible debt. So you need to think, if I'm going into debt, how does that thing give me a return? Either it must give me a return through saving me money, or it must physically have a means to adding to my revenue. And so, whether that's you're going into debt for your home loan, or if you're a farmer for your land, buying equipment, if you invested venture capital in another business and went into debt for it, that's a whole discussion on its own. So the principle behind that is why would we say that that's responsible? Well, it's because the costs of debt, I think we're going to get to it in a moment. We must always remember that debt has a cost to it. So if I'm going to do something that's going to have a cost to it and it's not going to give me a plus to offset that cost, why would I do that? Because then I'm just incurring a cost. And now I'm going into slavery basically with no upside. So why would we do that? So just a little comment on things like a vehicle. Watch out for debt where the thing that you are going into debt for depreciates, especially things like vehicles. Because you could debate, is buying a vehicle, even a farm bakkie, let's say, or for us in town, you need a vehicle to go to work and back. So it's not like you can just not have a vehicle. But, is that responsible or irresponsible? Should we be aiming to buy our vehicles cash because they depreciate so quickly? Now, I know not all vehicle brands depreciate so quickly, but generally speaking, vehicles depreciate. So, that's a good question to think about yourself, because clearly if it depreciates too quickly, you got to have a little question mark. Is that a good idea to go into debt for something that depreciates so quickly? So the flip side of that then is irresponsible debt is obviously whenever you are using debt to buy something that's not going to give you a return, or that you consume, or that devalues massively quickly, or it's not going to give you it's not going to yield a return. Sorry, I've said that already. So I often joke about, when you go to the shops and you go and buy some food, and then they ask you on your credit card thing there, do you want to, pay it straight or pay it off over 6 months, or 3 months? And then I'm thinking, that's food has been down the toilet for months already, and I'm still paying for it. Clearly there's a problem if that's what we are going to use debt for. So obviously things like be very careful when you are using it for things like store credit cards, microloans, using debt to pay school fees, any living expenses. I've added vehicles in there again because of the issue of the devaluation of vehicles. Vehicles is a bit of a gray zone. Obviously, farming equipment might be a little bit different, but typically I'm talking about cars and bakkies that depreciate so quickly. So I think that's the first thing. If you're going into debt, first question is this responsible or irresponsible? I think we'll take questions at the end, so I'll carry on. So then the next question I often get asked is, why are we suggesting that paying off debt is such a high priority? And should we be focusing so much on paying off debt, or should we rather be focusing much more on saving? And I just want to sketch a quick scenario. And remember, when we did the budget thing, we spoke a little bit about you must start off by having some emergency savings. Remember, I mentioned there that it's a good idea early on, if you're a salaried person, even farmer, try and build up a couple of months of expenses with cash that's accessible. So if you have emergencies, that you're able to pay for that without going into debt to pay for those things. That's why I circulated the thing about the washing machine, the Clearview advert that we circulated on the group. It's exactly that the guy's washing machine breaks. So what's he going to phone? Clearview is going to go into debt to buy the washing machine. If you'd built up a couple $1,000, you would then, have paid for that cash. So other than, let's call it your emergency savings, which I think is a very sound thing to do early on in your life. Make sure you've got a couple of months of cash to pay for emergencies. Other than that, then I want to suggest that debt is your priority. So I just first want to mention there are three rates to become familiar with. You're going to hear people talk about a repo rate. So currently the repo rate is 8.25%. The repo rate is basically the rate at which banks get their money, in simple terms. I know it's much more complicated than that, but in simple terms, that's the rate at which banks get their money. The prime rate is the rate at which banks usually will give a low risk loan to us. But because of banks, being a little bit risk averse, they won't usually give it to us at 11.75%. You'll often read, okay, this loan is prime plus 1% or prime plus 2%. So we normally will be paying that rate plus something. If you were very wealthy and the bank knew their money was safe and there's no risk to them, they might give that client a prime minus 1% if you were lucky. I think nowadays that's become more and more rare. When I was very young, you could still get loans, home loans at like prime minus 1, prime minus 1.25, that kind of thing. But since the financial crash, banks are not so risk, they don't have the risk appetite they used to have. So, you will see us, which is the third rate, is the rate at which we are being offered a particular deal. And depending what it is, that rate could vary between 13% all the way up to 28% for unsecured loans. All these adverts you see for phone so-and-so, and they'll give you 20,000 Rand or 50,000 Rand. Those are usually up there, 25 to 30% interest rates you will pay on those loans. Okay, so if that's what it's going to cost you to go into debt, in our case, typically 13 to 28%, and you compare that to saying, if I saved money, you would only be getting 6 to 8% on most investments now. So for that reason, why would you be trying to save money when you've got debt that's costing you 13%, and now you're trying to build up, and I'm talking about once you've saved your emergency kitty. Beyond that, it doesn't make sense to do that because it's costing you more than you actually would be getting in interest if you try to save the money. So hopefully that makes sense, that once I've got my emergency savings, focus on your debt. Some of the other reasons are that if you have debt, you're guaranteed to get that return by paying off quicker. So for example, if my loan is at 13.5%, that is a guaranteed after-tax return you are getting by whatever interest you've saved there. You saved the 13.5% guaranteed after tax. Now, there are not many other investments that are going to give you a guaranteed after-tax return of 13.5%. Usually those would be scams if somebody came and spoke to you about that kind of return, guaranteed. Also remember that debt savings, the money you save is tax-free. Whereas if you're going to earn interest, once you earn more than, it's just under 23,000, SARS starts getting interested in taxing you on it. And yeah, the costs of savings with paying off your debt is much less than if you were going to invest that in some kind of fund, where you usually pay admin and broker fees, etc. So it's much cheaper. You get a better return. So we're really just trying to say there are very sound cost-benefit reasons to focus on your debt. The example I was just explaining is what we put here, where I said start with your smaller debt. I'm not going to repeat it again, but it's just a reminder, that's the process we go through, where you pay it off, and then eventually you use that money that you used to pay on that first debt is now used to pay off your second debt. And that's why it's actually like a cycle that just grows and grows, a spiral in the positive sense. Okay, so now we're going to get a little bit practical. And our purpose here is just to make sure that we all have at least a basic understanding. So don't be too put off by the numbers, I hope. Just, hang in there and try and just get the basics. And those who are the buffins on this, you can take the spreadsheets we're going to send you and customize and make them much more sophisticated. But we're just going to show some basic examples. So let's imagine I was going to buy something let's use the example of a home loan. And let's say that the purchase cost of that was 950,000. Usually you will be encouraged to put down some kind of deposit. So let's say I put down a 50,000 Rand deposit, and the rest, therefore, I need to take out a loan to pay for. So my loan value would then be 900,000. The next concept is they will normally, or you should ask, what is the interest rate that I will then be paying on that? So for example, and always try and understand it's prime plus or minus what. Always ask them to explain to you, what am I paying relative to prime? Bearing in mind that prime was 11.75% currently. And, if it's something that's got an asset value behind it, then normally you'll be paying prime plus 1.5 to maybe 2.5 if the guys are a little bit greedy. If you are taking a short-term loan where there's nothing behind your loan, in other words, they don't have an asset, they will obviously charge you a lot more because if you stop paying, it's a much more difficult process for them to get their money. Then usually it will be a prime plus a bigger number. So the second question you've got to ask is, okay, what is the interest rate I'm paying? Then term refers to how long am I going to be paying that for? So they might say 20 years or 240 months. And in this example, your repayment would then be for a 900,000 Rand home loan at 13.5% for 240 months. I'm going to pay 10,800 Rand per month. That's my monthly repayment. Collateral is simply then saying for whoever lent you this money, if you stop paying, what can they go and attach? What is the risk to them? And normally, the more secure the risk is, the less they will want to do a prime plus a big number. So like if it's a home loan, they usually are quite comfortable that unless we're in a huge property bubble, they're quite confident property probably increases in value generally over years. So they're not too worried if they lent you 900,000 and after 5 years you stop paying, they're usually not going to lose their money. Unless you were in a major property bubble and the bubble bursts. But typically, they wouldn't worry. A car, on the other hand, is very different because they know the minute you drive that car out the store, it's already worth a lot less. So they usually have a slightly greater risk when they are giving you money for equipment that can devalue so quickly. So normally they will do a prime plus a slightly bigger number for that. So that's the whole thing about collateral and how the risk associated with your collateral affects your interest rate in very simple terms. What is a balloon payment? So a balloon payment, you typically see it on vehicles. So very clever of these bliksems. What they do is they basically, if you were buying a car and you did the same sum for a car, and we're going to do that, if you had to pay the car off in 5 years, they're worried that it's too expensive and that people won't want to do it. So what they say is, that's fine, we'll work out your repayment, but your final payment has to include 35% of your original loan value. So effectively, you have this massive balloon payment right at the end with your last payment. And what they're actually encouraging you to do is to say, no, well, at that stage, you'll have to trade your car in so that you then can have the money to pay the 35%. So that's a whole story on its own. The main point I really wanted to make here was watch out for balloon payments. You're a long way from owning that item, that vehicle. And you have this false sense of security during the repayments because your repayments look much cheaper, but you have this massive clock coming at the end of the term, where you then are basically forced to trade that car in and go into a new financing arrangement with them. So it just takes you so much longer to ever own that car, or own a car, let's say. So that's a little bit about balloon payments. Be very careful of them. They are a very unpleasant surprise at the end of the term. And quite likely, you can't afford the vehicle you are buying if you need to rely on a balloon payment. Rather pay it off in 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, whatever the period is, than have this big balloon payment. So 2 questions we want to now look at. So imagine this is now a house that we've bought, and we ask 2 questions. First question, if I now buy a house for 900,000 and I'm going to pay it off over 20 years, just on a piece of paper next to you or in your head, how much interest do you think after 20 years we would have paid on 900,000? And what goes with that is, therefore, how much do you think I would have paid in total at the end of 20 years? So if my original loan amount is 900,000, how much is this thing actually going to cost me? And you will be quite surprised to know. So what you're looking at here is a graph. On the bottom of the graph, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse, if it would just come up here. On the bottom of the graph is your number of months. So from your first month to month 240, so that's your 20 years. And here is my payment of 10,800 Rand every month, what I'm paying. The red is the breakdown of how much of that 10,800 Rand is paying off interest and how much is actually paying off the 900,000 Rand home loan. So in that first month, you can see it's a tiny little portion, probably 800 bucks, is actually paying off the loan. The other 10,000 Rand is just interest. You're not affecting your loan at all. And slowly that balance shifts towards when you get to the end after 20 years, the last month you're basically paying off is just purely paying off the loan and you're paying no interest. So a couple of interesting things. Number one, remember it was a 900,000 Rand loan. We would have paid 1.7 million in interest for that. So I hope that shocks you. I hope it shocks you that we paid nearly triple the cost of that house after 20 years. That's the cost of debt that we need to be aware of. And just an interesting one, if you ask the question, when would my monthly payment be more paying off my loan than interest? So if you look at where's about 5,000 bucks, if you went across here, you will see it's somewhere around 185 months. That's 15 years. So for the first 15 years of my 20-year home loan, I'm paying off more to the bank than I'm actually paying off against my house. That's a terrible, for me, that's a terrible thought. But that's the reality of a loan over a long period of time, like 20 years. Is you'll see later on, I use this phrase, when it comes to debt, time is not your friend. Time is your enemy. In other words, a long loan. Whereas when you are investing, time is your friend because of compounding interest and returns. So the first thing I just really want to get across is debt is not cheap. And so much of the money we are paying is actually debt. And we're going to go through a much more detailed example in a moment on Excel. So a couple of examples we want to show here is we're going to go, firstly, that example I was just showing you now, the base case, where we have a 20-year loan. But then I want to look at some things like, how does it affect that picture if we put down a 10% deposit? Because that scenario I was showing you on a graph was we put down, other than the 50 grand, remember we said we put down a 50,000 deposit. Other than that, there was nothing extra we put down. So if we put down a further 10%, what would that do to the term? Remember that the term is how long we will pay it off, and how much will it save me in interest? Or if I said, no, I don't have the cash to put down 10% deposit, but what I can do is every month, instead of paying 10,800 Rand, I'm going to pay 10,000 plus 10%. I'll pay another 1,800, 1,080. What will that then do to my term and my interest savings? Or if you go back to the biblical principle to say, you know what, we shouldn't really be enslaved even for longer than 7 years. Now, I know this is ambitious. If we had to say, okay, I can afford the 10,800 Rand a month to pay off debt, pay off my home loan, but if I want that to be sufficient to be debt-free in 7 years, what is my purchase price? So we'll show you that scenario to say, how much do I have to downgrade the expense of my house so that in 7 years I can pay it off? And then we'll go through some other interesting examples that Dave suggested, just to illustrate this whole thing about how much does debt cost, how does it affect how long I'm paying it for. So I'm going to flick to Excel. I don't know if there's any urgent questions that we want to deal with, and we'll send you the spreadsheet. For those of you who are not very comfortable with Excel, especially focus on the sheet I'm on now. For those of you who are comfortable with Excel, you might want to mess around on the detail sheet I'm going to go to in a moment. So the first example I was showing here was the one we've just gone through. Here's a home loan. 900,000 is our loan amount. 20 years. Our interest rate was prime plus 1.75, where prime is currently 11.75. So by the way, it is true that our debt interest rate at the moment since COVID has been quite high. You remember they hiked the interest rates when COVID came around because everybody got nervous with COVID. Whenever the banks and that are nervous, they push up the interest rate in simple terms because they don't like risk. And their way of covering risk is to charge us more, so that they've got more buffer in the interest they earn. So that means we would be paying 13.5% interest, and then our repayment in that scenario would be 10,800 a month. That's what I showed you on the slide. Just out of interest, if you went and bought a Hyundai i20, I can't remember when I pulled this off their website a month or two back, but a little i20 costs about 310,000. If I had to pay that off in 5 years, and they probably would charge me something like prime plus 2.5, depending upon your circumstance, that would be about 7,200 a month if I didn't have a balloon payment. You go and look at the adverts you will see on the websites. You'll usually see there's a balloon payment, and then this number would be like 4,900 per month, or they'll usually try and keep it just under 5. But then there's this big balloon payment coming at the end of the period. If I had to go and buy a center pivot, cost me $1 million, I was going to pay it off over 7 years. And is it Westbank, or who offers you guys money for that kind of thing? Let's say it was Westbank, and they said prime plus 2. That means I would be paying about 18,000 a month off to pay that off over 7 years. So the kind of gut feel numbers I just want to, the ratios I just want us to get to is, remember the 2 questions we should always ask. How much am I going to be paying in interest over the period? And how many times am I paying extra? What am I paying off extra compared to my loan amount? So remember the home loan? We asked that same question. If I just open that up for these specific examples. So there, remember, we said we would basically be paying off a total of 2.6 million for that 900,000. We would have eventually ended up nearly paying triple our original purchase price, with 1.7 million being our interest cost. In the example of the Hyundai, because it's much shorter, we're paying nearly 1.5 times, 1.4 times our original price. So we would have paid 125,000 Rand in interest for that 300,000 Rand car. Center pivot, we would have been paying about 500,000 Rand in interest for that R1 million loan. And yeah, costing us nearly 1.5 times. So just a crude rule of thumb. If you are taking out debt for about 5 years, 5-6 years, you can see you're going to end up paying basically 50%, just as a round number. Park in your head if you're not interested in Excel. A 5 to 7 year, I'm going to end up paying 50% of the purchase price in interest. That's, you can see it's between 1.4, 1.6%. Okay, close as damn it. Easy number to remember. Half of the purchase price, that's what it's going to cost me at the current interest rates. When you're dealing longer terms, that 1.5 starts heading, by the time you're at a 20-year repayment. So this is like if you were buying a farm, you know, or a home loan, and you're paying it off over 20 years, then you're talking closer to triple you'll end up paying. So, you know, then you can say double your money, double the purchase price is your interest, and 1 times is to pay off your loan, if that makes sense. So those are easy numbers for you just to park in your head. 5 to 7 years, half of the purchase price, I'm going to have to pay an interest, as a simple maths. When I'm at 20 years, you can triple it. I hope that those ratios just make sense. For those of you who like Excel, you can go into the detail. So just to help make it a little bit more tangible, I was just wanting to show you what was there in that graph. So in the first month of paying that home loan off, you can see basically all I'm paying off against my loan is 741 Rand. 10,000 Rand of my 10,800 just goes to the bank. It's not paying off a flipping cent to anybody. After 1 year, I'm still only paying 850 bucks off. Still 10,000 bucks going straight to the bank. By the time I'm in my third year, 970, still nearly 10,000 bucks. So for the first 3 years, 10,000 bucks per month going straight to make these banks rich. And we are paying off 800-900 bucks against our loan. That's it. So I'm hoping this creates in you a dislike for how expensive debt really is when you have a long term in particular. Similarly with the car, even from day one, it's nearly half. That half is interest, half you're paying off the car. After a year, obviously the pendulum is now swung because the period's so short, it's only 5 years. Now already I'm thankfully paying off more towards my loan than I am in interest. With a center pivot, interesting. So 7,000 Rand is actually paying off the center pivot, 11,000 bucks going straight to make the bank rich. That crossover only starts happening in about year 2 to 3, where you are paying off more against the loan than you are paying off the bank. So I hope that's just helpful to try and create a bit of a sense of when I have a repayment, how much am I paying interest and how much, what's it really costing me? And what does the total picture look like till eventually I paid this thing off? Because I think sometimes, because we don't always know what's behind this number, the monthly repayment, we don't actually have a good enough sense of how expensive it actually is. So that's the purpose of showing these examples. Just to take the home loan, and so I'm going to go to another level of detail now, so please don't dial out when you see too many numbers. So there was the first example, the default case, 900,000 Rand, 20 years. Remember, and there's our 10,000 Rand. Now, remember we said if we paid 10,000 Rand deposit, so, in other words, we put down 90,000 Rand. That's the first example I want to show you. What happens if we now did that? So we put down 10%. So you can see here, right in the first month, we pay 90,000 Rand, and then we carry on paying out 10,800 every month, going down. So basically, instead of us being debt-free after 20 years, we now would be debt-free after 13 years and 8 months. We would have saved 740,000 Rand in interest by doing that. That's actually quite shocking. I don't know I mean, I really hope you're feeling, I can't believe that a mere 10,000 Rand made such a difference. It saved me 7 years on the home loan, nearly 7 years, and saved me, $750,000 bucks in interest, just for that 10%. It's actually quite shocking. Then if you ask the question, okay, I don't have 90 grand to put down now, but maybe I can pay off an extra 10,000 Rand a month, 10,000 Rand, 10% off every month. So on the right of that, I've got another example where we pay off an extra 10% every month. Then you can see we would be debt-free slightly longer. It will be 4 months longer. Remember, this was 13 years and 8 months. Now it's about 13 years and 12 months. And I wouldn't have saved 750 in interest. I would have saved 600. So the message behind this is, well, even if you can just afford to pay off every month, you are still saving yourself many, many years of being indebted, and you are saving a hell of a lot of interest. I mean, 600,000 Rand in interest is not to be sneezed at. But it is even better to put down the money up front. So the message is, make every effort. If you are going to if you're going to go into some debt, the bigger the deposit you put down, the more it's going to save you interest and term quicker. The other example I wanted to show you was, if we now said, okay, can we ever do the biblical principle where in 7 years I'm debt free? So that now turns this thing around to say, okay, I'm happy to pay the 10,800 that we calculated previously, but work it now back to say, in 7 years at 13, what can I then buy? Basically, it says you would need to go and find, not for 900,000, but just under 600,000, you would have to go and find a property for 600,000, and then you would be debt free in 7 years. So, that just flips this thing around, and you can play around here by saying, okay, what about 10 years? It would then say, okay, it's now 700,000 Rand you could buy, etc. if you can't do 7 years. So for those of you who are comfortable with Excel, if you want to play around, you can play around with the deposit percentage or the monthly extra I pay off in these variables. You could say maybe I could pay off 20% per month, and it will then tell you how quickly do you pay it off and how much are you saving in interest the whole time. So these little pink blocks or whatever the color is on your screen, you can put in different values there and it will work out that scenario for you. So let's just leave that at 10% for now. Leave that at 7 years. The final scenario is really just for those of you who are Excel geeks. We've got some people who want to get very technical. So we built what I call the mix and match scenario. So this is a scenario of a couple who says, okay, early on in our life, we are going to use one of our salaries where every month we put away money because we've got double income, we've got no kids. And then after 2 years, we're going to have a kid. So I can't pay off anything extra. Sorry, after 1 year, we're going to have a kid. And so there we just default back to where we only pay off the repayment amount, nothing extra. So for a couple of years, I pay nothing extra. And then at some stage later, by year 5, both kids are now at play school and both couples are working again. And now we can start paying off some of our extra salary from one of the people. In other words, you can mix and match according to your life situation. And it will then tell you how quickly are you debt free and how much interest have you then saved based on a month by month projected how much you can put away extra, etc. So that's just in case we have any people who really want to play around with a real life situation. For me and my wife, this was the approach we used because early on we tried to make sure that a big chunk of her salary we could pay off extra against the home loan because we wanted that she could choose how long she wanted to stay at home for once we had kids. So we didn't want to rely on her salary to pay off our debts at any stage. But obviously, I think times have changed a bit. That's a bit more tricky. So the purpose of showing these was simply to give you a little bit of a sense of if you put down money as a deposit, it really is first prize. It saves you a hell of a lot of term and it saves you a hell of a lot of money. So that's just a little bit of detail for those who are interested a bit more in the numbers. I want to go back to the summary and Dave, what's that guy's name who speaks about the grandparents saving for their grandchild's home loan? Craig, what's his name? Craig Hill.
Craig Hill, yeah.
Okay. So Dave asked to do a little example with what Craig Hill is talking about. Okay. So here's an example where a grandpa says, okay, I've just had a grandchild. I'm going to put away 500 Rand a month for the first 25 years of that, till that kid is 25 years old. And the current, I mean, you should definitely be able to put away money into a savings account and get 7% at the moment. If the grandpa did that, put away 500 Rand for 25 years at 7%, after 25 years, the balance in that account would be 650,000 Rand, which if you worked it back to today's money, because remember in 25 years, 650,000 Rand isn't worth the same then as it is now because things devalue. So the current value of that, the present value of that is closer to 192,000 Rand. Okay. So now if we went back to our 900,000 Rand townhouse example, and we now know we could actually put down a 21% deposit, 192 divided by 900,000. So if I went to my sheet here and I said, imagine we put down a 21% deposit. What that says is that this guy would basically be debt-free in 10 years, 9 years, 12 months, okay? 10 years. So if a grandparent did this for one generation, they would halve the repayment term for that grandchild. So think of that blessing that this grandfather is giving to this grandchild, that where everybody else pays their house off in 20 years, they're going to do it in 10. They will save themselves a massive 1.1 million in interest. I mean, what an absolute incredible legacy to leave for your grandchildren. So for those of us who are the old toppies, it's never too late to start. If we're busy, Dave and Marks, you've got grandkids who've just been born. You know, I'm hoping this like really inspires us to get this ball rolling, because sure, we may not give our grandchildren a house for free in one generation, but think of it, in one generation, we've managed to halve the scenario. And when that grandchild, now uses the privilege they're going to have of saving that much interest and how quickly they will be debt free, surely they should be passing that baton on and saying, okay, I can now still repay the 10,000 thing, but I'm going to do this for my children and their children's children. You pass the baton on, and within 2 or 3 generations, they're going to be buying that house cash free. You would have saved enough money. So try and get your head around that. It's actually mind-blowing.
Yeah. So Vaughan, just to chip in there, that obviously comes from Proverbs of 13 or 22, which says that a righteous man leaves an inheritance for his children's children. And so just to chip in, if the grandparents are doing that, and if the parents, so the next generation, if they do it for their grandchildren, that grandchild, so 2 generations down, the next generation, you won't have to borrow anything from the bank. But the thing is, it's got to start somewhere.
Yes.
That is Craig's thing there, is that he says it only takes you to start it. And even if you can't do 500 Rand a month, if you can do 100 Rand a month, you see the impact that it has on that whole sum.
Yeah. I mean, even $250 gives you the 10% scenario. Where you would then give your grandchild a 10% deposit on a house, 11%. Okay, so hopefully that just sows a little bit of, as I said, when you're investing, time is your friend. When you're in debt, time is your enemy. The other example Dave asked to do is the whole thought about solar, because I think Dave said this is something very relevant to what's being offered to farmers now. So the question we're wanting to deal with here now is, let's say I was going to put in a solar setup that was going to cost me 900,000 Rand. And I know that if I go to the bank, I would either have to, 2 scenarios. If I'm going to go to the bank, they would say to me, I'll give it to you to pay off over 6 years. And you then went and did your calculations to say, for that solar setup, I will save myself so many kilowatt hours per month. And that's worth, in this example that I'm using, it's worth 20,000 Rand. What that then says to you is your return in this scenario, where you are saving 20,000 Rand against a loan of 900, you would be saving yourself a return of 17%. But obviously, if you were using debt to buy that, they would probably be charging you about close to 14% interest on it. So if your return is 17% and your cost is 14%, it means you should be clearing 3% in that scenario because of the cost of debt. And so if that number only came out, if you worked out your savings and say that number was 18,000 Rand a month, and it then says your return is 13%, and you were going to have to go into debt to take it, you would then be stupid, because you are only going to be getting 13% savings, but it's going to be costing you nearly 14%. Why would you do that? You want a safety margin well in excess of 14, 15%, because remember, you want some safety margin. So make sure, if you're going to do this kind of calculation and you are going to finance it through debt, make very sure that that return is well in excess, not just of 14%, but maybe kind of 16, 17% minimum, so that you've got some safety margin. Otherwise, you may as well not do it. If your debt cost is more than it's going to save you, it's a no-go. If the picture is very different if you're going to buy it cash, though, which is the second scenario, option 2 I'm going to show you. So lesson number 1 is make sure if you are going to get a certain monthly saving for your solar setup and you are going to go into debt to buy it, make sure that this return, that it works out for you here, is well in excess of the cost of your debt, which will typically be somewhere around 13.5 to 14%. If you're going to be on prime plus 1.5 or so. So I hope that makes sense if you're going into debt. If you are not going into debt, if you're going to pay it cash, then all you've got to compare it to is how much would I have got if I didn't spend this money? I would have earned interest on that 900,000 in the bank. So then you've got to compare it to the 8% you would get in terms of you would have been earning interest. So in that example, let's say it worked out, I would only save 16,500 Rand a month. Then I would get 9.6% return. Well, that 9.6% is still nicely clear of the 8. It still makes sense to do it because I will be getting a better return by getting the Eskom savings than I would have if I left the money in the bank. I hope that makes sense. I'm just trying to illustrate this understanding that when you have to finance something through debt, there's a much higher return hurdle you have to get because debt is more expensive than the money you earn in interest if you have had the money in the bank. So, you know, when you're doing the calcs, you've got to say, what is my Eskom savings? How much return is that going to give me on the original purchase price? And how does that return compare to either my cost of debt, if I was going to finance it, or the interest I would have earned if that money was lying in the bank? Again, it's very simplistic, I know. I've just assumed that the 20,000 Rand stays, you know, your Eskom will put their tariffs up after a year. So in that month that they put it up, you should actually save slightly more. I wasn't even trying to get that complicated. I'm just trying to illustrate the principle of, you know, working out your return relative to debt if you are financing it and relative to the interest I would have earned if not. Okay, so I hope those examples didn't get too technical, but at least try and get the principles out of them. I'll send the spreadsheet. And yeah, hopefully it will help you just have some thoughts around debt and how to get rid of that debt. The next slides I'm not going to go through in detail. They are pretty self-explanatory. They'll be in the handout to read. But a typical question we get asked, especially for salaried people who now have to pay rent in town, is the kind of following scenario is to say, okay, there's this townhouse or home that I can rent for 7,000 Rand a month. And to buy that home would cost 900,000 Rand, the same example we were using. And so what normally happens is they can afford the rent of 7,000 Rand a month, but they could never afford, you know, that 900,000, remember, it was close to 11,000 Rand per month, 10,800. So they can afford the rent, but they could never afford to own the house they are renting. Whenever you have that scenario, I would suggest you need to think very carefully, because what it means is you will never be able to afford to own the home you are renting. And why would you want to do that in the long term? And so the slides that follow are really around saying, when is it valid to be renting and when is it not valid? Or am I simply just living beyond my means? And, you know, we get this a lot here in Centurion because rent is cheap in Centurion, purchase costs are very high. Just to give you an example, a townhouse here that you would rent for about 8,500 Rand a month would cost about 1.4 million Rand. So that's about a 16,000 Rand bond repayment that I could rent for nearly half that price per month. So the youngsters tell me, why the hell would I want to do that? I can stay in this beautiful townhouse for 8,500 Rand a month. What would I want to pay 16? I can't afford 16,000 Rand a month in bond repayment. And that's not even including all the levies and the stuff that goes with that. So this is quite a dilemma for those of us who are parents, for you guys who are students. You have a look at these slides. I think there's some good ideas to how to get around this dilemma. The bottom line is, if you are going to rent for valid reasons, you better be putting away some extra money so that at some stage you're going to be able to put down a deposit, because property is generally one of the good ways to diversify your wealth. I remember when they're talking investing, they always say, don't have all your eggs in one basket. Property is one of the ways to diversify. And there's a lot of tax and estate planning reasons for why property is as its pluses when it's your primary residence, for example. But you got to get past this dilemma. So the slides that follow are all just dealing with this. You can read through them. They're pretty self-explanatory. The bottom line of what I'm really saying is that if you are going to rent, you must be using it so that you are saving up to put down a big deposit, 15-20% deposit for the purchase price on a house. And you need to be very disciplined about that. Okay. All right. So those are, there's quite a few little slides. It's a lot of text that is pretty self-explanatory. When you get the hands out, you can go through it. Then, yeah, just some suggestions for homework again. Want to suggest you go and make a list of all your debts. Make sure you understand which is your most expensive debt. And like we said, start with that smaller expensive debt and develop a plan to start paying it off earlier. Most of the debt instruments we have, they don't penalize you for paying it off earlier. In the old days, there used to be penalties on some of them. Nowadays, I think the institutions are much more responsible. They don't penalize you, but you must find out, is there any penalty for me paying this off quicker? And typically there shouldn't be, but just check that. And if there's no downside, then go for it. Kill that small debt. And once you've freed up that money, you use that money plus your margin now to go to the next debt. And so you cycle through it. I always like to ask, why aren't we purchasing our vehicle cash? What's the plan? And how are we going to get to that point? On your longer term debt, what plan have we got in place to pull that term back from 20 years to 15 years to, 12 years, whatever? And in the longer term, what is your plan to become debt free? How long is it going to take? Because this is not just a 1-2 year process. Admittedly, this is at least a 5 to 10 year process. But if you want to become financially free and free up all that money you're currently paying off on debt, that money then becomes your money that you can invest and get that now passive income coming in. That's how you get freedom and legacy. Okay, Dave, that's really Flight my story is 8. Yeah, so over to you.
Right, thanks, Vaughan. Okay, I'm just going to stop the recording now. Just let me do that quickly.